Hello dear children, today we are going to study about the first chapter of your supplementary reader. The name of the story is A Triumph of Surgery. The subject of this story is a pet dog who is spoiled by its owner. The owner indulges her dog so much with food and other comforts that the dog has become overweight and cannot even walk properly. Finally, the dog is taken to a veterinary doctor who treats the dog without using a single medicine. The dog is left with all other dogs so that it can play and get much needed physical exercises. After a period of enough physical activities, the dog loses much of its fat and becomes hale and hearty. So now we are going to read the story with its detailed explanation. So here we go.
I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage, with a leg at each corner. Now, who's I here? I is the narrator. And why is he worried about Tricky? Because Tricky had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage. Now, what is sausage? Sausage is the finely minced meat which is stuffed into long cylindrical cases, and it is divided into small lengths by twisting or tying. And bloated means swollen up. So the narrator starts telling us that how he was worried about Tricky, a pet dog. The narrator, Mr. Harriet, stops his car as he sees Tricky with his mistress on the road, as the narrator is shocked to see Tricky because he looks like a bloated sausage. The dog had become so fat that it was a matter of concern. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition, so I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much, really. Now, the dog's eyes had become bloodshot, red, that means, and rheumy. Rheumy means there was a watery discharge from the eyes, and the dog took his tongue out. Lolled means to hang something loosely, especially a drooping out. You must have seen the dogs drooping their tongue out from the jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. Mrs. Pumphrey, she tried to explain the doctor, that is Mr. Harriet, that she thought that Tricky was malnourished, and because he did not have any energy and excitement, she told him that she used to give him malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night, apart from his regular meals, so that he could sleep at night. Although she gave him so much to eat, she says that she doesn't give him much to eat. She actually pampered the dog so much, she used to give the dog a lot of food to eat. She did not realize that she was actually overfeeding the dog. And did you cut down on the sweet things I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak. I had to relent. He does love ice cream. Sorry, he does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. Now, the narrator asks her if she had cut down on his sweets as he had asked her to do. To which she replies that she did it for a while, but she felt that he was getting weaker, because of which she had to stop being so harsh with him. Also, she says that she is unable to refuse him cakes and chocolates, as these were his favorite things. So, see how Mrs. Pumphrey was pampering the dog with cream cakes, chocolates, and so on. She said that she can't be so rude and so harsh to the dog because she loved the dog so much. So she could not refuse those things to the dog. So that is why she was giving all that to the dog. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey had mentioned. Now, see, this was a matter of concern because he was a veterinary doctor and he knew the problem. And he says that the problem was the only fault in Tricky was that he was greedy. He had never been known to refuse food. He never refused food. Whenever the owner gave him the food, he ate it. Okay, and he would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. Doctor knew that Mrs. Pumphrey had not mentioned everything she was giving. This was whatever she mentioned was a part of things she was giving to the dog, right? Because this happens with the children also. No, we do not know at times, like we are not hungry and we should not eat that, but the things which we like, even if we are full, after having our food, we go for that, isn't that? So this is greed for food, right? Okay, so the narrator understood Tricky's problem. The dog was very greedy and could eat at any time of the day. He did not know how to say no to food when his stomach was full. The narrator also thought to himself of all the things that Mrs. Pumphrey would not have mentioned, which he fed Tricky. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has his little box with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago. So there has been no ring throwing lately. Now, now the lady says, Mrs. Pumphrey, she's been asked by the doctor that if she was giving plenty of exercises to the dog. In return, what she says that yes, a little exercise like small walks with the lady, because the gardener who was taking care of the dog was himself not well. He had muscular pain in the lower part of his back, that is in his lumbar region, so he was not able to take the dog out for the game, that ring throwing game she's talking about. The dogs play such kinds of games and they enjoy themselves, like you throw a ball or a ring, they go run, catch and bring it back to you. So these are the pretty famous kinds of games which the dogs play. So the gardener also used to play this ring throwing game with the dog, but those days the gardener himself was not well, so even that kind of exercise he was not doing. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right now and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Now the doctor was really, really annoyed, and he says he was very harsh, and he said that this is my serious advice to you, Mrs. Pumphrey. If you do not give more, if you do not restrict the diet which you're giving to the dog, and if you do not give him more exercises, he's going to be really ill. So you have to be very strict about the diet of the dog. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Now, after listening this, Mrs. Pumphrey knew that whatever the doctor was saying was right. But it was too difficult for her to, accept that, because it was really difficult for her to refuse the dog for anything. She loved the dog so much, she pampered the dog so much that she could not say no to anything. Whatever the dog liked, she wanted to give that thing to dog. So she felt so bad, so sad, that now she had to be very strict to the dog. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. See, you can very well imagine, like a lady like Mrs. Pumphrey, who was supposed to be a very rich lady, she had all kinds of accessories, all good, coats, the summer coat, the winter coat, the rain coat, the beds, and all toys and everything for the dog. She pampered her dog to a great extent, right? So Mr. Harriet was watching them go and looking at Tricky walking unsteadily because he was tottering along. The dog was not able to walk properly because of the weight he had. The narrator was also looking at the tweed coat that Tricky was wearing. He had a wardrobe full of these coats. See, even the dog had the wardrobe, right, where he had various kinds of coats, coat for cold weather, raincoat for wet weather, right, wet days. So this line also suggests that Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich lady, as she had a lot of money to spend on her dog. When a person can afford to have this much for the dog, then that means that that person is really wealthy. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. Now see, he struggled on drooping. Now who's he? He's the dog Tricky, and he struggled on drooping. Drooping means, I told you earlier also in the beginning, bent downwards. Now I use this word for drooping tongue, if you remember, right? Now here he struggled on drooping in his harness. Harness, you all know. Harness is a strap or string which you wear, like when you go for your adventurous sports, then also you wear this harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Distraught means extremely worried, extremely tensed. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. Means just after frequently, very frequently, he was vomiting, right? And he spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Panting is breathing with short, quick breaths or getting out of breath. Right, when you run fast and you stop, then you take short quick breaths, that is panting. Okay, so the call came after few days. Mrs. Call from where? Call of Mrs. Pumphrey to Mrs. Pumphrey called the doctor, right? So Mrs. Pumphrey was very upset as Tricky was not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes, and was vomiting frequently. So it was a great matter of concern because now Mrs. Pumphrey was really worried because the dog was not even eating what he liked, what he always wanted to eat. So that means it was a serious issue and there was something very wrong with the dog. He didn't even want to do anything. Now, I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in the blanket. Now, being a veterinary doctor, the doctor knew that the only way to get Tricky well was to get him out of the house for a few days. He then suggested to Mrs. Pumphrey that it would be good to get Tricky hospitalized and keep him under observation for 15 days. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Pumphrey nearly fainted. Why she nearly fainted? Because she was so sad that she could not live without the dog, and also she said that the dog would also not be able to live without her. So she said that he would surely die if he did not see Mrs. Pumphrey. But the narrator kept his words. He told her that this was the only option as Tricky was very ill. The narrator thought it would be best to avoid any delays and get him to hospital as soon as possible. He went to their house, and even though Mrs. Pumphrey was crying because she did not want her dog to go away from her, he took the dog and wrapped it in a blanket and put him in the car. He did not want to waste any time at that moment. The entire staff was roused. Entire staff. This also shows that Mrs. Pumphrey had, a lot of wealth, because a person who could keep a lot of staff, who could pay money to so many people, means that the person was wealthy. So the entire staff was roused. Roused means put to work, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. Now, the maids were then woken up and asked to get out all of Tricky's stuff. His stuff included things like his day bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, and blah blah blah. And Mr. Harriet knew that so much stuff won't fit in his car. So he started rushing things. As the doctor was leaving with Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey threw a bit of coats that Tricky used to wear in the car. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now, as the narrator was turning the car, on the turn he saw through the rear mirror that everyone was crying. Now, why everyone was crying? Because the doctor was taking away the dog, and everybody loved dog. So he patted the little helpless animal, who responded by wagging his tail. The narrator then thought and told Tricky that he knew that Tricky did not have any energy, but he surely had a way to get him better, because he was a doctor and he knew that he is going to make him better very soon. At the surgery, a place where a doctor treats patient. Now see this word surgery. This means this is a place where a doctor treats patients, right? So at the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. Now, what happened? The moment the doctor entered the surgery, the other household dogs, those who were already there, they searched. Search means moved suddenly or powerfully forward or upward round the narrator. And Tricky looked down at the noisy pack. Now here pack is the collective noun, and here pack is used for a group of dogs, right? So the a poor dog Tricky, he looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, because he did not have that much energy to play with those dogs. When put down, lay motionless on the carpet. So when he was put down on the carpet, he lay motionless. He was he did not have any energy to move around. He did not have any energy to play with the dogs. So the other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided that he was an uninteresting object and ignored, because he was not playing with them. So when he was not playing, he was not showing any interest in the other dogs also ignored him, and he was just lying at one side all alone. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him. Kept an eye, to keep an eye means to keep somebody in observation, giving him no food but plenty of water. Now, doctor knew what he had to do. He did not give any food to Tricky, but he gave plenty of water to Tricky. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day, he began to whimper. Whimper means he began to take out feeble sounds, right? When he heard the dogs in the yard. Okay, so this means that now he was, gaining some energy. The narrator made the bed for Tricky and a warm box along with the other dogs. For 2 days, the narrator kept him just on water and nothing else. On the second day, he roamed around looking at the place around him. Means the second day he started moving, and third day he became a little active, right? When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Now, when the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and was surrounded by Joe, who was a greyhound. Greyhound is a breed of the dog, and his friends. Again, after sniffing him for a moment, all of them left for the garden. All of them means all the dogs left for the garden where Tricky followed them. Later in the evening, the narrator was present at the dinner time and was watching all of them, especially Tristan, as he was slopping the food. Slopping the food means spilling over the edge of a container. All of them were eating with great speed because they knew that if they didn't finish quickly, then the other dog, after finishing his meal, would come to eat their meal. Right? When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled, and squashed every few minutes. Now the scenario changed. What happened? Now, when everybody finished their food, Tricky went around looking at the shining bowls and also licked a few bowls. The very next day, an extra bowl was put for him, and the narrator was happy to see him running towards his bowl. Then he started getting better really quick. He did not require any medicines and started playing with the other dogs the whole day. They all used to play with each other, bump into each other, walk over each other, and squash each other. So there was a tremendous improvement seen in Tricky. Tricky started playing with the other fellow dogs also. So this was a step towards his improvement. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meat times and hunting rats in the old henhouse at night. He had never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. All of the other dogs accepted him as a family member. Although he was very different from others, as he was very well taken care of by his owner, and the others were not, because he was supposed to be, he was supposed to be taken good care, because his mistress was, after all, a wealthy woman and she had provided him with all luxuries in the life, whereas the other dogs were not living a luxurious life. He also used to fight for his meals with his fellow dogs who were much larger in size than him. At night, he would also hunt rats in the hen house. He was enjoying, and this all he did not do in the house where he was living earlier. So he was enjoying as he had never done such things before. All this while, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call more than 12 times a day to inquire about Tricky, like whether doctor was giving him the right coat to wear, the night bed or the day bed, and the other things. Mr. Harriet used to avoid questions about the coats, beds, etc., but he told her that Tricky was doing very good and was recovering very fast. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. Convalescing means to recover from the illness. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now, what had happened? Mrs. Pumphrey wanted Tricky to recover very fast. And when she got to know that Tricky is recovering, she got so excited that she started sending 2 dozen eggs every day for him. For him means for Tricky. But Mr. Harriet and his partners would have 2 eggs each for breakfast. What happened was the eggs were sent for Tricky, but the eggs were not given to Tricky. The doctor and his partners, they were enjoying the eggs. Not because they never wanted to give it to Tricky, because they wanted to eat it. Because the reason was that Mr. Harriet was a doctor and he knew that Tricky did not need that meal. So that is why, in order to consume that, not to waste the thing what she had sent, they used to eat it. And not only eggs, to improve the quality of blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine. Then it became Mr. Harriet's habit to have 2 glasses of wine before lunch and a few along with it, because now she started sending wine also. And then the doctor was not ready to give that wine also to the dog, because he knew that that was not required by the dog. So they started consuming the wine themselves, they started eating the eggs, and they enjoyed every bit of it. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in brandy. At that time, Mr. Harriet was not able to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. They shared it amongst themselves. Some days, Mr. Harriet used to feel very happy as he would start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and then ending the day with brandy in the evening. So, he was actually enjoying the eggs, the wine, and the brandy, whereas Mrs. Pumphrey was thinking that she's the eggs, the brandy, and wine which she's sending, it is given to the dog. But It was not given to the dog, it was consumed by the doctor and his partners. But that didn't mean that the doctor did not want to give a dog the things because he wanted to eat it. No, the reason was that he did not want to give those things to dog because that was not good for dog's health. That is why rather than giving it to the dog, they were consuming it themselves because they never wanted to spoil the health of the dog. It was actually an extra dose for him. So that is why he did not give those things to the dog. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Now, because of all the things that were being sent for Tricky, Mr. Harriet was really tempted to keep him as a permanent guest at the surgery because every day the eggs were coming, wine was coming, brandy was coming, and doctor was enjoying all that. So he wanted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest at his surgery. He really wanted that Tricky should stay with him forever, but then he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and really wanted Tricky to come back soon. So after 15 days, Tricky was ready to go back home, and Mr. Harriet called up Mrs. Pumphrey to come and pick him up. So within a few minutes, a long black car, this gleaming black metal means long black car, came outside. And when the chauffeur opened the door, chauffeur means the driver, opened the door, Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, really nervous as well as excited. She was excited because she was going to meet the dog after such a long time, and nervous, a little nervous because maybe if the dog doesn't recognize her, or she had a feeling that the dog would not come running to her the way it used to come earlier. Means she was a little nervous whether the dog has forgotten her for within those days. So she was a little nervous and also excited because she was going to meet the dog whom she loved so much. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a little hard muscled animal, and he was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. Now, when the chauffeur opened the door, Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, really nervous as well as excited. She was asking with a nervousness in her voice that was Tricky really better, to which the doctor replied positively. He said yes. The dog is absolutely fine. Then Mr. Harriet went inside to get Tricky. When Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, he saw all the dogs moving around in the garden, and Tricky was sitting between them. He had recovered wonderfully in 2 weeks. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs, and his chest was touching the ground. He had become a good muscular dog within 2 weeks. So now the dog was absolutely fine, perfectly okay to be handed over to the lady. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "Oh!" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. Now, when Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house, he saw that chauffeur was still holding the door of the car, and as soon as Tricky saw his mother-like mistress, he was overjoyed. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started licking her face, barking in excitement. You all know how dogs love their owners, their masters. They show their great love towards their masters and barking in excitement. While all this was happening, the chauffeur and Mr. Harriet got all his stuff out to the car, which had not been used during the treatment in the last 14 days. So doctor did not use any of the beds, toys, cushions, coats, bowls, whatever luxurious items Mrs. Pumphrey had given to the doctor. He did not use anything for the treatment, and he returned everything as it is without being used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." Now, this was the very, very emotional moment. When Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving, she leaned out of the window and said to Mr. Harriet with tears of joy in her eyes that she could not thank him enough for what he had done. This is a triumph of surgery meant that the treatment that was given to Tricky had been successful, and she was really obliged that doctor had made Tricky absolutely perfect and fine. So, this was the explanation of the chapter. I hope you've understood the story. Thank you.